In 1792, a team of French surveyors were sent out to measure the distance between the North Pole and the equator, via Paris of course. 6 years later they had a result, and 1/10,000,000th of that value was then set as the new standard for measurement of distance, called the metre. The resulting 1 metre long platinum iridium bar was then a reference to which all other lengths could be compared. And you might say it's intrinsic to planet Earth and has special meaning. But you'd be wrong, because even though the surveyors were extremely accurate for their time, there were still errors in their measurements, and the Earth just isn't that spherical. So despite being arbitrary or based on dodgy experiments, units of measurement are extremely handy for comparing things and then communicating that comparison to other people in an unambiguous way. For example, if I say this note is a B flat, I could then tell somebody else, and even if they have no knowledge of frequencies or harmonics or resonance or tuning or temperament, they can still reproduce that same note, and together we can play music. The story of why we have notes named A through G, and why C is the starting point for the major scale, and why A is tuned to 440 cycles per second, is more a story of historical happenstance than it is of scientific rigour. Back 1,000 years ago, monks were singing Gregorian chants using Pythagorean tuning and the diatonic scale that they had inherited from the Greeks. But rather than always starting from the same point, they used this pattern of tones and semitones to make modes, choosing one note as the final and then extending up or around that. The highest mode they used was called Mixolydian, and the lowest was Hyperdorian, with the full range then covering just under 2 octaves. They then named all of these notes using the Latin alphabet. This made perfect sense at the time, but it wasn't long before things got messier. The first thing that got added was a note at the bottom, which they called gamma, extending the range to a full 2 octaves. And then they got rid of the top half, replacing it with lowercase versions of the low octave. This system stuck around for a while, and it was great for people who could read, but back in the 9th and 10th centuries that didn't cover very many people. So a new system was developed by an Italian monk by the name of Guido of Arezzo that used a simpler scale of only 6 notes, called a hexachord. And the note names in that hexachord were pulled from a hymn where the starting syllable of each line was on a successively higher note. You could then use those syllables to tell somebody what interval to sing. You could then slide this hexachord up to a new starting note, and the intervals always stay the same. Except when you get to here, starting on F. Then B doesn't line up with the hexachord note Fa. And if you sang a B, you'd be singing a tritone, which is a big no-no in music of the time. So they split B up into 2 versions, a soft B and a hard B. To slide this hexachord any further up required more notes. And then the full range that they used from gamma ut all the way up 2.5 octaves was known as the gamut. And this system was, again, really useful for a very long time, but as music got more complex, this system became very cumbersome, and so needed a big overhaul. The movable hexachord idea gave way to a single octave worth of notes. Ut was hard to sing, so it got changed to do, and the 7th note was added that was eventually called Ti. And we have the solfege system of naming notes, an idea so handy that it was independently arrived at in the Indian, Chinese, Byzantine and Japanese music systems, among many others. And if you make do the note C, they all line up. We've already added a soft B, but due to increasing complexity in the music, they soon needed a hard F too, and then a soft E and a soft A and a hard C, and we're back to the 12 notes that we started with. But now they all have strange names. These notes don't represent distinct pitches yet though, only intervals, but that's really all you need to be able to pin a song down. So if I start on a random pitch on this note, and then play a simple children's melody, there's no doubt as to what that song was. But look back through the videos on your phone of the last family birthday gathering, and you'll hear that knowing the intervals of a song doesn't necessarily cut it when it comes to singing in tune with one another. You also need to agree on a starting note, and then you're fine. Happy birthday. For a very long time, the only agreement that was needed was with any local instrument that was difficult to retune. So when an organ played an A, that was A. And when the tops of the pipes got cracked from all the endless hammering to keep them in tune, you chopped the tops off all the pipes and everyone sang a little bit higher. And while people did know that different sized pipes and strings of different lengths and tension would produce different notes, they didn't really know exactly why. And it wasn't until 1681 when Robert Hooke was essentially the first person to stick a playing card into the spokes of his BMX and discovered that frequency of vibration and pitch were equivalent. "30 years later, John Shaw invented the tuning fork, and the idea of keeping everyone in tune with one another was now possible, even though it took a really long time for it to catch on. Early examples of tuning forks show that they used A at about 422 Hz, but the choice of reference frequency varied a lot over time, from 409 to as high as 455. There's no one reference frequency that's better than another, of course, but they're not all exactly equivalent either, because human beings and instruments have limitations. Some instruments have peaks or dips in their resonance at certain frequencies, and if you can tune them so that those problems aren't lining up with a note that you're going to play, they sound much better. My sitar, for example, I tune between C sharp and D for that very reason. Singers would insist on a lower reference frequency to make singing easier, but orchestras would often creep that frequency higher and higher over time to make their orchestra sound brighter than their contemporaries. Attempts to standardize this reference frequency by the French used a value of 435 Hz, but the British preferred 439, but scientists hated that because it was a prime number and difficult to replicate in lab conditions, so it got bumped up to 440 Hz, which became the international standard in 1834, although not officially adopted until 1955. That hasn't stopped orchestras from continuing to creep their reference frequency higher and higher, so now orchestras will sometimes use 445, for example. And yes, some people on the internet will tell you that A should be tuned to 432 Hz. The mathematics behind their reasoning is dubious at best, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and try an experiment. So here's the same piece of music tuned to two different frequencies. Did you think that that second one sounded more mellow, more chilled out? Well, that was the one that was at 440. The first one was just above 448. It was the difference between them that gave that perception of it being warmer or more relaxed sounding. Now, don't get me wrong, there are amazing special numbers out there that are so intrinsically linked with the nature of our universe that even aliens would have to agree on their value. But they all have one thing in common: they're dimensionless. If you tack on a unit like meters or seconds or kilograms onto the end of a number, you're multiplying it by some arbitrary made-up reference number, and then any specialness goes out the window. In the case of frequency, it's cycles per second, and seconds are defined by light emitted from a cesium atom. And in the case of meters that we had at the start, that's also now defined using cesium atom vibrations, because it's defined as the length that light travels in a vacuum in about 3.3 nanoseconds. But if you insist that whole numbers are somehow more pure, well, you're still out of luck, because here in the West we're using an equal temperament system, which means that even if you do start on A being 432 Hz, or any other whole number for that matter, every other note is going to be an irrational number, and that's about as unwholesome as you get. Like I said in the previous episode, nature doesn't really play well with whole numbers, and in upcoming episodes I'll be comparing these elegant mathematical models of how instruments work with real instruments, to show you just how wrong those models can be, and how that only adds to the beauty and nuance of music. But that's all for now. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I make a new video every week, and YouTube thinks this one might be of interest to you. A big thanks to my supporters over on Patreon. You're amazing. If you would like to join them and support what I do here, the link is in the description. And to all of you, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.